Cast. Thank you everyone on this call. I really appreciate you inviting us on to talk about this. Over the next hour, we're going to be running through the state of play, where we are right now, why filibuster reform is so important. Adam Jennelson's on. He's going to join us. He's just joined us. He's going to talk through the history of the filibuster and how it's being abused right now. He's the author of the new book, Kill Switch. We're going to talk a little bit, do some Q&A with Megan and Trey and Adam about what's going on now, what reform could look like, what needs to happen to make that happen. We'll hear from Trey about some words on how we message about the filibuster. Trey's a former colleague of mine in Senator Murray's office. I'm excited to hear what he has to say. We'll hear from Megan Hatcher-Mays from Indivisible and about how people can get engaged. Then we'll hear finally from Jen Mandelblatt, who'll talk about some tools that people can use. So everyone can ask questions. People know how to use this. Raise your hand, ask questions. We'll try and get to as many as we can while we all talk about this. So I'll kind of set the stage with a little bit of a state of play before we turn to some conversation. I'm pretty sure everyone on this call knows that Democrats have won full control of our elected federal government. President Biden won the White House. Democrats won the House. On January 5th, with two incredible victories in Georgia, Democrats won control of the Senate as well. So people across the country stepped up and they made their voices heard. They were sick and tired of the gridlock and dysfunction, sick of Trump's policies, Republican policies, sick of the hatred, the division. They made it clear that they wanted change. They wanted the kind of change that Democrats were promising. They wanted more money in people's pockets, jobs and economic growth, healthcare, gun safety, voting rights, climate crisis. The list goes on and on. This is what Democrats across the country campaigned on, and this is what people voted for. So I think people fairly expect at this point that when they put Democrats in power, they were going to get that agenda. But as we'll discuss today, the elections were not enough. They were necessary, but not sufficient. They were just one important step in the process to get all of those promises delivered. Right now, even though voters put Democrats in charge, we still have this outdated Senate rule called the filibuster that allows Mitch Mcconnell to keep calling the shots. So let me step back 1 second and explain what a filibuster is. Adam's going to talk a whole lot more about the history and what it is in detail, but put very simply for those who may not follow arcane Senate processes closely, the filibuster is the rule that allows a minority of senators, just 41, representing an even smaller proportion of the American population, to prevent a bill from even getting an up or down vote. There's a lot more detail that Adam will go into, but essentially a bill can have 59 senators supporting it. It could pass the House. It could be ready to be signed into law, but Senator McConnell can use the filibuster to just stop it dead, make sure it never leaves the Senate, and block progress on anything and everything. That's what he did during the Obama years. Many of us are old enough to remember that. That's exactly unless something changes. So let's look at what happened recently on the COVID rescue bill, because I think it's a really good example of how things can work and what the problems are. As we all remember, President Biden and Senate Democrats were committed to delivering on their campaign promises. They said they were going to get a robust COVID relief package over the finish line, and that's what they intended to do. They reached out to Republicans. President Biden made clear, Senator Manchin and others made clear that they wanted to work with Republicans. They reached their hand out, but it takes two to tango, and Republicans made it equally clear that they had absolutely no interest in dancing with Democrats. They were focused on the politics. They wanted to make President Biden fail. They wanted to do what they tried to do to President Obama and make him into a liar. President Biden talked about bipartisanship. Republicans wanted to be able to say, no, that didn't happen. Nothing changed. This was a bill with 70% public support. Democrats, Republicans, and independents supported this bill, but not a single congressional Republican would sign on. They were that committed to partisan gridlock that they would not sign on. They would not put their name to it. Now, thankfully, we could talk about the details of this. This bill was able to pass because it was in a reconciliation bill that was exempt from filibuster, that couldn't be filibustered. But the reality is, and the scary reality is, if it could have been filibustered, it would have been filibustered. And people across the country wouldn't be seeing the checks they're seeing right now. Vaccine distribution money wouldn't be going out. States and local governments would not get the money they need, and people would be hurt. People would feel the pain. And it wouldn't be the Republicans who got blamed, even though they stopped it, it would be Democrats. And that's fair. Democrats control government. Democrats are held accountable for what gets done and not done. So it became clear right from the start that McConnell was playing from the same playbook that he'd been playing since 2009. He was going to block anything and everything, and he was going to use the filibuster to do that. So here's what's coming up next. Bills are passing the House. And from the Equality Act, gun safety legislation, PRO Act, DREAM, John Lewis voting rights bill, George Floyd police brutality bill, just to name a few, and they are slamming into the brick wall of the Senate filibuster. And the bill that people on this call care a whole lot about, the For the People Act, is shaping up to be a major fight on this front. Again, we're going to hear Adam talk about some of the racist history of the filibuster, but I will say right now that the filibuster has historically been used to block civil and voting rights. It's shaping up to be used that way exactly again. We see in Georgia, states across the country, fundamental voting rights are being attacked. The For the People Act would address this, and Mitch McConnell and his Republican caucus are intent on blocking it. So it passed the House, it's moving through committee in the Senate right now, as you all know, and then very soon after that, Democrats are going to face that choice: protect democracy with the For the People Act, or protect the filibuster, what President Obama called a Jim Crow relic that can stop the For the People Act dead in its tracks. That Leader Schumer said that failure is not an option when it comes to this bill. That's a really good sign. He is committed to getting this done one way or another. That's what he's saying, and that is critical. So momentum is growing. There's more and more people who understand the connection between the filibuster and the agenda that we need. More and more people are signing on, more and more people are calling their senators, more and more people are joining calls like this to learn about what they can do to help. And that's going to be so important, and that's going to be the only way that we can get this over the finish line. So with that, I will turn it to Adam Jenelson, who is the executive director of the Battleborn Collective, a new group as focused on advocating for progressive policies, and the author of Kill Switch, a book about the Senate history and the filibuster. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Ellie. Let's make sure I'm unmuted. And thank you, Demcast, for hosting us. And thank you, all of participants, for being here. It's so important to have this many people engaged, to see so many faces. And it's very, very encouraging for the cause of reform, because this is, as Ellie said, a critical issue. It's basically the difference between whether things get done or don't get done. And it's really great to have so many people engaged. So I'll just try to spin quickly through about 200 years of history. I think the most important thing that I want to drive home tonight is that the filibuster was never meant to exist. And in fact, it was very much meant not to exist. It's funny doing these calls and actually writing this book, because I'm not an originalist. I don't think we should be parsing the framers' words for what our laws should say today about things like civil rights or abortion or anything really. But I do think that it's important to look at the system that they designed, because part of what we're seeing today is that they designed a system that was supposed to be capable of change, and the filibuster is preventing it from changing at all. And the reason that this blockage was put in place was primarily driven by the desire to uphold white supremacy, and this is true throughout about 200 years of history. So the reason we know the filibuster was not meant to exist is that the framers were very explicit about this. They created a government that was supposed to be majority rule at every decision point. There were a small handful of extraordinary measures that they thought should have to clear a supermajority threshold, but they enumerated those in the Constitution. Those are things like amending the Constitution, passing treaties, which at the time were considered the sort of highest order of government, and removing elected officials from office. Everything else was supposed to happen at a majority rule basis, including in the Senate. The Senate was supposed to provide a more thoughtful counterweight to the House, but that was supposed to be done through having senators be elected to longer terms. They serve 6 years instead of 2 years in the House. Representing a broader constituency, they're responsive to everybody in their state as opposed to a smaller district. And having only a third of the body up for re-election at any given time. Anytime you have every 2 years when you have an election, only a third of the Senate, about 33 senators, are up, whereas every 2 years, every single member of the House is up for re-election. So those are the ways in which the Senate was supposed to perform this sort of cooling function. It was not supposed to have a supermajority threshold. The Articles of Confederation, the first draft of American government before the Constitution, did have a supermajority threshold in its Congress. The framers put it there because the framers of the Articles of Confederation, because for all the reasons that we hear when defenders of the filibuster talk about it, they thought a supermajority threshold would promote compromise and consensus. But in practice, they saw that it did the exact opposite. It gave the party out of power the ability to gridlock things when they didn't like what the majority was doing, or even just for the sole purpose of trying to make the majority look bad. So the framers saw how dysfunctional a supermajority threshold could be in the Articles of Confederation. When they designed the Constitution, they said, we don't want that. Everything's majority rule all the way through. The Senate should have thoughtful debate, but there should be limits to it. There were strict rules to limit debate, and there were lots of norms governing the fact that when you debated a bill, you were supposed to keep it thoughtful and to the point, not get obstructive. This lasted for about half a century. And then in the 1830s, a man came to the Senate named John Calhoun, who was the senator from South Carolina and the sort of spiritual godfather of the Confederacy. He was the father of this theory called nullification, which was the idea that states could nullify laws passed by the federal government. And he started to forge what we would consider the talking filibuster and sort of the modern conception of the filibuster. Prior to Calhoun, obstruction was not a major thing in the Senate. It was very rare. Senators spoke on the issue and then they stopped speaking, and then bills came up for majority votes. But Calhoun started innovating what we would think of today as the talking filibuster, where he and his allies would speak on the floor for a long time to delay passage of a bill. Calhoun's primary driving motivation throughout his entire career was preserving white supremacy and upholding slavery and the power of the plantation class in the South. So this major innovation in basically the creation of the filibuster was driven by the desire to preserve slavery. Fast forward 100 years to the Jim Crow era, the early 20th century, and this is when the filibuster acquires the ability to impose a supermajority threshold. So just to underscore this point, throughout the entire 19th century, the Senate remained a majority rule body. Even though this filibuster started to come into existence, it was still the talking filibuster. Senators could talk for a long time and they could delay a bill, but they had no ability to increase the number of votes it required to pass a bill. Whenever senators were done talking, the bill would come up for a majority rule vote. And that remained the case well into the 20th century. In 1917, the Senate passed a rule that put a majority threshold on the books. This rule was intended to help cut off debate. The idea was that a supermajority of senators could come together and say, this debate has gone on for too long, let's all agree to cut it off, and then we'll move to the majority vote, which will be the vote to pass the bill. During this time, in the Jim Crow era, white supremacist senators of the South realized that they could start imposing that threshold on civil rights bills. So they combined the talking filibuster with the need to impose this supermajority procedural vote to cut off debate. And so the only category of bills to which the supermajority threshold was applied all through the first half of the 20th century was civil rights. Every single civil rights bill that came before the Senate was blocked by the supermajority threshold. And that is why civil rights didn't pass for nearly a century, between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until the passage of the first major Civil Rights Act in 1964. I just want to underscore this point because it's critical. Everything else that came before the Senate during this period passed on a majority rule vote. So all of the New Deal programs, the creation of the interstate highway system, creation of national parks, all of that stuff passed on a majority rule vote. The only thing that was forced to clear a supermajority were civil rights bills on a consistent basis. So this is its racist history. It was founded in the desire to preserve the interests of the planter class, and in the early 20th century, it was explicitly strengthened and given the supermajority threshold ability to block civil rights bills. And so that's how it came into being. Then in the 70s and 80s, senators started to use it on different topics. Both parties used it a bit, but it still maintained its status as preserving the interests of the status quo. It was used far more by Republicans than by Democrats. It's a tool that makes it easier to block things, and therefore it advantages conservatives inherently over progressives. But during this period, it was still used relatively rarely. Under Mitch McConnell, it skyrocketed. McConnell's strategic insight, as Ellie mentioned in the beginning, was that if he started deploying this ability to increase the number of votes to 60 to everything, he could impose gridlock. He could go at Obama's Achilles heel. Obama, came to office promising to fix our broken politics in Washington. So if Mitch McConnell could show that Washington was gridlocked and that nothing had changed, people would turn against Obama and the Democrats. and that's what he did. So this tool that was forged in white supremacy continues today to uphold the interests of the status quo. As Ellie said, this is what Republicans are going to do to Biden as soon as they have an opportunity, as we're going to see probably on this hate crimes bill that Senator Hirono has put forth. They will likely filibuster that. And that is what it does. It empowers a narrow minority that represents the status quo and represents entrenched powerful interests, the ability to block any kind of progressive change that this country desperately needs. So I see that we're moving on in time here. So I'm going to stop there with the history lesson. I'm sure we can come back to it during question and answer, but I'll let the program move ahead.
Great, thank you, Adam. We've already got a bunch of really good questions in the chat. So I will start our panel off, I think, with a question for Megan, pulling Megan in from Indivisible. Megan heads up the democracy program at Indivisible, does a lot of work on this issue with groups. So a couple of people have asked in the chat the various forms of the question. I'll read Betsy Rubin's question. Senator Manchin has said in print he will never vote to end the filibuster. Senator Sinema is almost as adamant. What do we do about that? Megan,
Sure.
what do we do about that?
Well, it's not fun if it's not a challenge, right, Betsy? So look, I think if you are on Twitter as much as I am and probably as much as Adam is, you've probably seen this meme called the Manchin cycle, right? Where controversy arises, that's step one. Step two is he criticizes the Democratic position. Step three is that he encourages bipartisanship. But ultimately, step 4 and 5 is he gets there. So right now I'm just tapping the sign. Right now we're at step 3, where he's encouraging bipartisanship. And that's what that op-ed was all about. It was about, he said in his, I'd like to parse it actually a little bit if you'll allow me, because he said, hey, this is a really popular bill that the For the People Act is a really popular bill that has bipartisan support, which is true. It's just not in Congress. It doesn't have bipartisan support in Congress, but it does if you were to ask like your average independent or Republican voter. It does have a lot of support, especially the campaign finance provisions and the anti-corruption provisions. But he says he wants to be able to give Republicans the opportunity to either to come on board and support it. He's not going to find them. He's not going to find 10 Republicans who are interested in fixing our democracy. But a really important line in this op-ed was, Democrats have the responsibility to seek Republican input, but Republicans have a responsibility to stop saying no. So I think that's just a really important takeaway from that op-ed. Yes, he said he would never eliminate or weaken, but I can imagine a scenario in which for him, the talking filibuster, it does not count as weakening it. And I'll let Adam or others chime in on like the pros and cons of the various proposals. But that's actually a scenario that kind of gets Joe Manchin everything he wants. Republicans get a chance to say what they need to say about whatever. They get a chance to weigh in, but eventually they have to stop saying no. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think that Joe Manchin is going to want to be solely responsible for blocking literally everything, all business in the Senate from moving forward. And possibly that's my own naivete, but I think we're going to get to step 4, where he announces support for the Democratic position, and ultimately he will vote with the Democrats, but it's going to take some time.
That's I completely agree, and I also think that a number of people have mentioned this before, but right now this is an abstract academic issue. This is a conversation on Twitter and in conversations with reporters and press about something that hasn't even happened yet. But very soon it's going to be a real choice, and then it becomes very different. Anyone else want to jump in on Senator Manchin Sinema?
Yeah, I just would echo Ellie what you said. I mean, I agree with everything Megan said. But Ellie, to your point that this is abstract, Republicans are pointing out to reporters right now that they haven't actually filibustered anything, and they're right. The ARP, which is the only major piece of legislation passed so far, passed on reconciliation, so Republicans didn't have to filibuster it. And so it's easy for Manchin to sort of take this position when he is not actually standing in the way of anything getting passed. Later on, within a few weeks, probably, there will be a bunch of things that got filibustered by Republicans. And then the spotlight turns to Senator Manchin in a very different and more intense way. And all of a sudden, he is not just sort of, taking a noble stand for bipartisanship. He is actively standing in the way of passing very popular things that are popular even in West Virginia. So I think at the end of the day, he's gonna find a way to get there, unless, of course. And I would also say I think he genuinely believes that he himself can foster a new era of bipartisanship, as he put it in his op-ed. And more power to him if he can. But I think that it's gonna take the experience of trying to foster that new era of bipartisanship and failing, as I think is likely, before he really has to face the question in an intense way, where it basically becomes: are you going to pass President Biden's very popular agenda, or are you going to be basically the sole person, you and Sinema, standing in the way? And I think that's a much more difficult version of the question coming down the pike.
Agree. Well, now I'll turn it over to my former colleague, Trey Easton, who's senior advisor for the Battleborn Collective, worked in the Senate with me for a while, knows the Senate inside and out. So a question that we're getting a couple of different versions of, I'll read Rebecca Buchanan Mackey. Rachel Maddow said the other night that the Senate parliamentarian decided that the Senate Dems could basically get around the filibuster an indefinite amount of times using reconciliation. Is that accurate? Trey, can you talk us through what that is and why it's not enough?
Sure. So good evening, everyone. As Ellie mentioned, I used to work with him and now work with Adam at Battleborn Collective. And the announcement by the Senate parliamentarian was, I think, a good thing, generally speaking. It gives Democrats more bites at the apple to get things across the finish line using only Democratic votes. But the process that is being informed by that, the reconciliation process, is one that we just actually went through for the American Rescue Plan. And we saw that it has its shortcomings, right? We saw that the Senate parliamentarian, the same woman who just ruled that Democrats can use this same process, an indefinite amount of times for the next couple of years. That same woman ruled that the $15 minimum wage had to be stripped out because it did not comply with very arcane budgetary rules, this process known as the bird bath. We don't need to get into it. But so there are limitations to reconciliation, and it's not meant to be something that is used multiple times, right? The budget process is supposed to happen once every year. It's supposed to be a thing that allows the priorities for the appropriations process to be set forth, not some sort of workaround to basically that admits the truth that Republicans aren't willing to come and work with Democrats. So that's what we're sort of staring at here. It's not the kind of the balm that a lot of Democrats in the Senate are pushing it at. It is a great tool to have in the event that more obstruction comes down the pike, but it is not meant to be the way that governing is supposed to work, and it definitely has its limitations.
Yeah, thank you, Trey. I think that's a really good explanation. And just to underline one point, I think right now we have a Senate where Supreme Court justices can be confirmed to a lifetime appointment with a simple majority. Taxes can be cut for corporations. We can do some work on, we could do some good stuff in the tax code and on budget bills. But when it comes to gun safety, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to voting rights, civil rights, police brutality, so many other things, there is a supermajority requirement, and this plays right into the Republican playbook. They are right now. They are a party that says that government is dysfunctional, that says that government can never be a force for good, and then they use the filibuster as their weapon to prove that point. So they're happy with a Senate where things they like can pass with 50, and then nothing else can pass, and 60 votes are needed for any kind of progressive or even not even just bipartisan bills get filibustered. So that's something that Republicans are happy with. It's something that we see McConnell try and, it's why he defends the filibuster so vigorously, and it's why it's such a big problem right now. But Adam or Megan, want to jump in any more on reconciliation before we move on?
Just that it, the ruling, like as Trey said, gives you more bites of the apple, but it doesn't expand the scope of what can pass through reconciliation. So all of the things that could not pass through reconciliation, like Trey mentioned, minimum wage, still can't pass through reconciliation. So that includes HR 1, that includes voting rights, that includes gun control, probably many climate change priorities. So it gives you more time to use this tool, but the tool is still relatively limited in what it can accomplish.
Great. Good questions in the chat. So next got a couple of other questions about potential reforms. So I'll read one from Erica. What is the likelihood that the filibuster in the short term is returned to the original talking filibuster with required attendance? If not, what about the long term? Thank you, Erica. So I guess I'll kick that one off and say, there's a lot of talk about reforms, potential reforms. It was very encouraging to see President Biden and Senator Manchin out there critiquing the status quo and making it very clear that the filibuster isn't working right now, not the way it was ever intended, and certainly not working to promote bipartisanship or compromise. So they laid out, Senator Manchin said that maybe he thought the filibuster should be more painful. And he alluded to the idea that members should have to come to the floor. There's a lot of interesting conversations about this. This is one that's been discussed for a while now, over 10 years. I think the best thing that could happen is the filibuster is eliminated. That is the cleanest, simplest way to fix this problem and take that weapon out of Senator McConnell's hands. So I would say, as we look at any potential reforms, the way I think about this is this a reform that will allow a bill to get to an up or down vote with a simple majority? If the reform after allows the minority to weigh in, sure, allows debate, deliberation, but after a reasonable time frame, can a simple majority pass a bill that the majority supports? If yes, it's a good reform. If no, it may just be another tool that McConnell will use to create more gridlock and obstruction. I think we could all imagine how he would have members line up to talk nonstop if it's in the interest of protecting the status quo and his special interest allies. We know if there's one thing he's passionate about, it is protecting his corporate friends' rights, so-called rights, currently protected rights, to spend unlimited amounts of money helping Republicans win elections. And that's something that he's passionate about, and we know he'll go to the mat to defend that. So that to me is the most important thing. If there are reforms short of full elimination, they have to be real reforms. They should actually move the Senate in a better direction and allow bills to pass with an up or down vote. And any discussion should be viewed through that prism from my perspective. But I'm definitely interested in others who want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I just have like a related point, which is that, everyone on this call, I know, worked your tails off to, win back the White House and flip the Senate. Like, I know that is true. And so what we ended up with is this trifecta, right? And we got this opportunity to govern. I really need people to know that, like, those don't last forever. Trifectas are very rare and they're very, very fleeting. So I know that a lot of us think like, oh, well, the midterms aren't until 2022. We actually don't have that long. We probably have until like people start announcing primary challenges to vulnerable Democrats before people start, the Democratic senators start moderating their positions and don't want to go as big. So like what I'm getting at here is that we don't have a lot of time to waste listening to people talk. So if we do bring back the talking filibuster, we would need to bring in some other rules changes so that you can cut off the talking relatively quickly, because we really just don't have a lot of time. I mean, we're, HR 1 is a fantastic bill, which, obviously Indivisible has endorsed, and it would do an enormous amount of good to fix our democracy. But we're running up against a timeline here where some of the provisions in that bill need to start going into effect ahead of the 2022 midterm. So if we're going to pass this bill, we need to get on it, and we can't spend a lot of time, kind of letting Ted Cruz bloviate Lindsey Graham has already said he'll talk until he falls over, and I'm sure that's true. Who knows how long that might actually be, but we really don't have time for that. So I agree with Ellie 100% that the cleanest move forward is to wholesale just abolish it. I know that people have concerns about like tit for tat, that sort of thing, and we can talk about that later. But what we can't do is adopt something that seems to pass muster for Republicans or whatever the case may be, but ultimately just grinds the Senate to a halt. I'm sure, Adam can talk about this more and Trey can talk about this more, but like the reason that the talking filibuster doesn't exist anymore is because it ground, I guess, Senate business to a complete stop. That's why people now can just, basically object from their office without having to actually walk down and talk.
Yeah, I mean, right. As I was saying before, that, during the Jim Crow era, the filibuster blocked all the civil rights bills that came to the floor. It was the talking filibuster that did that. So it can be very effective at blocking things. So I totally agree with Megan that we're going to need something stronger than just a talking filibuster. Maybe it requires senators to take a couple bites at the apple before they hit on something that works. but I'm hopeful that once they get in the process of doing this reform, the worst case scenario would be to, start the reform process and then leave yourself in this purgatory where you've started to do reform, but you haven't actually achieved a regime of reform where you can actually pass bills. So I'm optimistic that once they start, they're not going to stop until they get themselves to a place where they can get the upside of doing reform, which is to actually pass things. But I think it's, the hardest part is pushing them to take that first step, and that's the challenge we face right now. And I also just 100% agree with Megan about we don't have much time. I think a lot of the provisions of HR 1 need to go into effect relatively soon if they're going to have any impact on the 2022 midterms and certainly on the gerrymandering that's about to take place as soon as the census data comes in. So, there is a serious urgency here that cannot wait until 2022.
Yeah, just to put a finer point on it, the maps, the congressional maps, that's like the whole ball game. Like if we can't get those fixed ahead of 2022, we'll be stuck with them for 10 years, a long time.
Republicans know, they are learning. They understand now clearly that they do not have a majority of support in the country, and they are doing everything they can to cling to a system that allows them to win with a minority. And it is a dangerous place for a democracy to be, and Democrats should feel some real urgency. So let's do one more question here, and then I want to turn to get some insights from Trey on how to message, hear from Megan more about what people can do, and then Jen will wrap things up with some tools. But the last question is a question that I know I get all the time. I think lots of us get this all the time, is what happens when the shoe is on the other foot? What happens when the filibuster is gone, Senator McConnell's back in charge once again at some point? Who knows how much longer he'll be here? It could be another 20 years. Who knows? Republicans could win the presidency again, that it's possible. So what happens when Republicans are in full control and Democrats no longer have the filibuster to stop the worst of what Republicans can do? So I'll turn to this one to Adam, who I worked with Adam. We were there in 2013 when this issue came up, and there was a robust debate about whether Democrats should change the rules and get rid of the filibuster in the face of obstruction. Adam could talk a little bit about how that went down and what lessons that has for today.
Yeah, I think, to answer the question, McConnell will just get rid of the filibuster when he's back in power. I think that, it's easy to see it maybe staying in place for like minor stuff. But if we don't do the things we need to do to get rid of it now in the hopes that it will be there for us when we really need it, the minute there is a bill, like it would have to be a Republican trifecta, right? So, White House, Senate, House, all controlled by Republicans. So just think, sort of put yourself in that scenario and think through, a bill coming up that passes the House, that the Republican president really wants. It comes to the Republican Senate and it can get 51 votes, but not 60. And the base is demanding it. McConnell will get rid of the filibuster with the flick of his wrist. He did that on the Supreme Court nominees. He got rid of it to confirm Justice Gorsuch. So I think one thing we know about Senator McConnell is he has no principles. He only does what is best for his own personal political survival and the interests of the Republican base. So the minute that the base wants the filibuster gone, he will get rid of it. It would be one thing to leave it in place for ourselves if there was no cost to doing that. Then it's like, why not? Maybe we can use this down the road. The problem is that leaving it in place incurs an enormous cost right now, because if we leave it in place, we won't pass many critical priorities, including HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, along with gun control and other things. So, if you forego all of these critical things that we must pass in order to leave this defensive tool in place, I think that is probably not the right strategic calculation, given that you are incurring an enormous cost to yourself and the country and potentially our democracy to preserve a defensive tool that McConnell can get rid of as soon as he wants to. To Ellie's point about 2013, this is something McConnell likes to sort of throw back in our face and say, oh, you guys got rid of it on judges, and then I confirmed all these judges because you made it easier for me. But the reality is he would have gotten rid of it himself there too. Because we got rid of it in 2013, we were able to push through a huge raft of Obama judicial appointments. When we had this fight in 2013, Obama was on track to leave office with the fewest number of judicial confirmations of any president since Ronald Reagan. because we got rid of the filibuster in 2013, we were able to get him back on par. So there are many Obama justices serving lifetime appointments on the federal bench today who would not have been there if we hadn't done this filibuster reform. If we left it in place, Obama would have left office with the fewest judges since Reagan. Then McConnell comes into power in 2017. The minute Dems start filibustering his precious judicial nominees, he would have gotten rid of it himself. So you sort of project that onto legislation. If we forego the things we need to pass, we're going to put ourselves in a hole. And then when McConnell comes into power, he's just going to laugh all the way to the bank as he, first of all, it's easier for him to come back into power because we didn't pass HR 1, so that happens sooner. And then he laughs all the way to the bank as he then proceeds to get rid of the filibuster and pass whatever he wants to pass. So that is my take on it.
Great, that is helpful. Well, we're going to have some time, I hope, for more questions at the end, but now I will turn to Trey Tracy, I mentioned before, from Battleborn Collective, my former Senate colleague. He is the rare Senate policy staffer who not only understands deep in the weeds of the policy, but also how to talk about it like a normal person to normal people, not in the wonky terms that, no disrespect to policy staffers, but sometimes they get pulled into. So I'll hand it to Trey to talk about how to message on the filibuster, how to talk to people about it, how to persuade them.
Totally, and thanks again, Ellie. And I kind of actually want to pick up really quickly on that most recent point. There's lots of concern about what Republicans might do in a filibuster-free Senate, right? And I think we only have to look to 2017 to 2019 when they had unified Republican control to see sort of some of their worst, right? They had been desperately trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act for the preceding, 7 or 8 years, and they finally got the opportunity to do it. And they didn't have enough Republican votes to actually do their signature legislative priority, because it's a pretty good test case that when progressive policies get passed, they become popular because the government gives people things and then people recognize, oh, actually like having healthcare and not getting kicked off. So it's important to remember that, our agenda as progressives, as Democrats, people pushing for change, it is popular and it is good for people. And it's important to message around that as we move forward here. Jumping back a little bit to some points that Adam said, I just kind of want to dispel maybe 3 myths around the filibuster, because it's important to do that as we go towards this conversation. One of the big myths, and Adam touched on this, is that this is how the Senate's supposed to function. Like the supermajority threshold exists because the founders and their enduring wisdom, blah, 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 blah. And it's just simply not the case. So it's really crucial that when we hear those messages out and about, that, and Senator McConnell's very fond of saying this, Senator Manchin is very fond of saying this, that this is the essence of the Senate. It's simply not true, and it must be discounted every time it exists out in the ether there. The second piece is that the filibuster promotes bipartisanship, and I believe you mentioned this evening we've got some recent cases of that simply not being the case. It actually prevents bipartisanship. You go back to the Manchin-Toomey background check bill. You go back a few years before that, the DREAM Act was brought to the floor, I believe, twice. Both of these things had bipartisan support, and they still were not able to overcome a filibuster. So it's not promoting bipartisanship, it's protecting inaction. It's very crucial to underscore that as we're having these conversations with people. And the last one is sort of a pet peeve as a person who lives in the Beltway, and I spend too much time on Twitter like everyone. You sort of see this conversation around the filibuster and around 60 vote thresholds as if it kind of just exists in a vacuum, and surprise, it just takes magically 60 votes to get things across the finish line in the Senate. And that's simply not true. There is a person who is forcing it to take 60 vote thresholds, and that person's name is Mitch MCConnell. So it's very crucial that we place the blame on the person who is promoting this obstruction. That is Mitch MCConnell. We cannot let him get a get out of jail free card. So those are the sort of 3 myths I want to dispel. And then we have some proactive arguments around filibuster reform, around what sort of our brave new world in a filibuster-free Senate could look like. It's actually, the getting rid of the filibuster probably is one of the best arguments for bipartisanship. So in the Senate, there are lots of must-pass pieces of legislation, things like the Farm Bill, things like the annual Defense Appropriations and Authorizations Act, things like the Surface Transportation Act, things that, just fund things that basically happen all across the country. And those things are bipartisan specifically because they have functions and that touch the places all across the country. So we already have a model of bipartisanship with the filibuster. So those things are going to continue to need to be passed if we get rid of the filibuster. So it's important to remind people of that. And the other piece around, what bipartisanship could look like in the Senate is, let's say you're a senator in the minority and the filibuster is gone. So you know that if the majority controlling the Senate wants to pass a piece of legislation, they're going to pass it, regardless of whether or not you want them to. If you're a senator, you're then given the choice to either just sit on the sidelines and let that legislation that's going to pass regardless kind of get away from you, or you can do what politicians tend to do and engage in the process to make that legislation better for your constituents, because you know that it's going to be passed and implemented. So that is an incentive for bipartisanship. Right now, we have an incentive for polarization and tribalism, because right now it's basically just don't let the other side get any victories and hopefully we'll beat them at the next election. So that's an unsustainable piece. And we can actually imagine a world where bipartisanship is restored because we got rid of the filibuster. The second proactive piece is, a lot of folks rightly are concerned around how the Senate would function and, try to imagine what this would look like. And I would, we need to look no further than so many state senates across the country that do not have supermajority thresholds for their legislative business. I would note particularly that Arizona and West Virginia's state senates do not have supermajority thresholds for their legislative business. And we actually have 2 alums of both of those chambers currently serving in the United States Senate. So they have recognized and lived in a place where there aren't supermajority thresholds for basic business. I think if it can work in those places, it can definitely work at the federal level. And then the last piece that I would just sort of underscore here is that it's very hard to pass legislation in the United States of America already. The House has to pass something and the Senate has to pass that exact same thing and it goes to the president. Or the House has to pass something and the Senate passes something else and it goes to a conference committee, and then that report has to be passed by the Senate and the House and it goes to the president. What the filibuster does is actually adds another step to what's already a cumbersome and difficult process. The framers established this process, and again, I don't want to sort of get into their mindset, but we have it such that it's hard to get things done already. What the filibuster does and enables is basically preventing basic business, the people's business, from happening. So this is a piece to make sure that we, reiterate when we're having these conversations with our friends and families. This is not promoting any kind of high-minded debate. It's actually preventing just basic functioning of our government, and that is untenable and unacceptable. So just in closing, some key points to leave you all with. This is not how the Senate was supposed to work. Anytime someone says that, this is the founder's wisdom or whatever, it's completely bull, and it cannot be allowed to just kind of persist unchallenged. The filibuster does not protect bipartisanship. It protects inaction and it promotes tribalism. So it's a thing that's really becoming a poison in our politics, and we only need to look back to January 6th to see how the extent of tribalism can get us in this country. So getting rid of the filibuster is actually a step towards engagement in our politics. The filibuster is this piece that makes legislating much harder than it already is. Why on earth would we have to add some sort of undue influence, some unnecessary arbitrary thing when we already have a very hard and cumbersome process? The other piece I would just underscore is the urgency that we've mentioned tonight. I'll just sort of really put a finer point on it. Senate Democrats are one seat away from being in the minority again. And we have not a lot of time to get a lot of progress happen and to begin proactively campaigning so we can reach our voters and make sure that we sustain these majorities in the coming months. And the last piece, we've kind of touched on a little bit here, is that so much of these conversations sound like the abstract, 60 vote thresholds and the filibuster and cloture and all these wonderful words. And what we're talking about actually are people's lives and the difference between a $15 minimum wage versus not. The difference between, common sense gun control that prevents and saves lives versus not. The difference between having a democracy that functions for everyone or not. We can have the filibuster the filibuster or we can have those things. And it's just really crucial to make sure that we remind ourselves what the stakes are and not get lost in sort of the back and forth of these kind of technical debates. And I've been talking for a long time, and I'll just turn it back over to Ellie at that point.
Thank you. One might even say that you were filibustering, but I would not say that. Thank you, Trey. That was really helpful. And I think that those are really good points for people to listen to. So I got a couple of questions in the chat on action. Vicky Palmerton said, what do we do to get the filibuster demolished? Constance Nolan said, besides voting in every state election, what can we do? Chandler Gobin said, what are some concrete steps we can take? I worry if we don't pass this, our democracy will perish. So we have a perfect person to talk about these questions. Megan Hatcher-Mays is the Director of Democracy at Indivisible. Before I turn it over to her, I just want to tell one quick story. Something amazing happened this week, last week, days are running together that really highlight the power of advocacy. There was an Indivisible group in California, and they have been talking to Senator Feinstein's office and going outside her office and asking for meetings for a while now, talking about the filibuster and the importance of reform. And just this week, their Senator Feinstein state director told them on video that Senator Feinstein, who had previously been seen as someone who is very reluctant, if not opposed to making reforms to the filibuster, was now committed to getting the For the People Act done and was open to a process that would get that done with 50 votes if Republicans refused to act. This immediately made the LA Times, it made CNN, and because of the work of advocates, because of the Indivisiblers, because of the advocates in Indivisible, they made change. They pushed their senator to do something different and to shift her position, and that made a difference. So to talk about how people can do that and what specific actions people can take across the country are, Megan Hatcher-Mays.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks for having me, everybody. I love to talk, so it's weird that I'm against the filibuster, but I'm happy to be with you all tonight. My face hurts from smiling. I love that story about our California groups in DiFi so much. I know that like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are like the big fish in this story, but there's a lot of other moderate Democrats that we really can't take for granted, and I think that what we've seen across the Indivisible movement, and not just Indivisibles, but other grassroots activists as well, really getting into this fight and pushing folks to be in the right spot. Like, we really can't take for granted. By the way, Senator Feinstein's colleague in the Senate, Alex Padilla, he's brand new to the Senate. You really can't take for granted, to have him come out within like a month of being sworn in saying he wants to get rid of the filibuster, he wants to pass these bills, he wants to make DC a state, he wants to fix the courts. That's a huge, huge deal. That's really not something that you can take for granted from a brand new member. We've heard really good things out of, he did actually say that about the filibuster. Yes, he said it on a statewide call with some of our California organizers. We've heard really good things out of Georgia from Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff, again, brand new to the Senate, coming from a state that had just very recently been ruby red, are making really good statements about the filibuster not getting in the way of voting rights. And we're seeing it from Amy Klobuchar, not always known for her like super progressive positions. She said she wants to get rid of it, full stop, and so did Tina Smith. So Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. So these are some really big wins that we've gotten. And we know that part of the decision-making process for these senators was hearing from their constituents. So we know that external pressure works. And sometimes when I say external pressure, people think like yelling outside their office, but that's not always it. Sometimes it really is just having a nice meeting where you outline all the great things that they have done and then talk about the things you want to see them do. So it's always about the carrot and the stick. Sometimes it's all carrot. Sometimes it's all stick. It just depends. So I would be remiss here telling you what to do to get involved, to not plug Indivisible. Of course, you can go to our website, indivisible.org. You can find a group in your area and join and get linked up with folks in your state to push on democracy reform, immigration, all of our core issues, economic justice. That is a way for you to get involved. We're doing lots and lots of things in all 50 states. Of course, this week is a big week for DC statehood, but we can't get DC statehood without getting rid of the filibuster either. So one of the questions on the table is, but how do we talk to people about like wanting to get rid of the filibuster. It's like a rule, it's wonky, it's kind of weird. My advice is, yeah, it's important to understand it, but really what's important is to make this like a real thing for people. And we've talked about this tonight, like, it's right now, it's just sort of like a ivory tower concept. It hasn't really come into play yet. We haven't had a lot of votes in the Senate that have like sort of ceremoniously failed, right? So it hasn't become real for people yet, but it's gonna start becoming real for people when Senator Schumer perhaps starts to bring some bills to the floor that cannot pass even with a 51 vote majority. So I think the best way to talk to people about the filibuster is to find out what it is that motivates them to be a part of this progressive movement. So whatever it is that motivates you, whether that's DC statehood, for me, that it's DC statehood. I live in DC, I have no senators. I really need your help, folks. Maybe it's like the labor movement, maybe it's climate change, whatever that is, we're not getting any of that if the filibuster is in place. So that is a really good way to talk to people about the need for this rule change. It's like, whatever it is that you want, we can get it, but we need to get rid of this rule first, and then we need to bring the entire Democratic caucus along. So that's my suggestion. As far as like where to target your energy, your own senators. Please don't call senators from states that you don't live in. It doesn't help, and they don't want to hear from you. In fact, in lots of states, it can be harmful. Like, for example, we know Joe Manchin does not like to hear from outside groups. So unless you live in West Virginia, please don't call Joe Manchin. But there are other ways that you can get involved. You can, there's lots of text banking opportunities, phone banking opportunities, those sorts of things. But a really kind of interesting possible tactic is if you live in a state where your senator is great on everything, maybe you live in, I don't know, I can't think of a state where everything's going great, but I'm sure there is one. Well, we still have some problems with Feinstein, but Padilla is really good. So, but if you live in a state where everything's going great, then go to your senator and say, okay, you're great. You're doing everything great. But what are you doing to bring along your colleagues? Because senators are people just like you and me. They are susceptible to peer pressure. So the next step is to say, what are you doing inside the halls of the Senate to bring along Joe Manchin, to bring along Kirsten Sinema, to bring along Pat Leahy, and to bring along some of these other people who are being hesitant about making these changes and kind of going big for our democracy. So you can go to your senator's website, see what committees they're on, look at the list of the members of the committees and see if any of those people are bad on filibuster, and then go to your senator and say, hey, can you talk to this person? You're on XYZ committee with them. Can you talk to them and see where they're at? Another really good thing is if you have a senator who is not yet in favor of getting rid of the filibuster, find out what issue is like their top issue. So for example, if you live in West Virginia, we know Joe Manchin cares a lot about labor. We know Joe Manchin cares a lot about healthcare. So really you can humanize those issues by talking to him about those. If you live in Washington State, hey, Patty Murray is the lead sponsor of the PRO Act, a big pro-labor bill. We can't get that with the filibuster in place. So those are some things to try to tie the filibuster to like tangible things for your senator. So there's lots and lots of work to do in your state. Please stick to your own state and find out ways that you can try to influence senators through your own senator. That can be really, really effective. It's been a really interesting 3 months since Joe Biden was sworn in. We've made huge, huge strides. I know that certain op-eds from certain senators can be frustrating and kind of get you down, but I think we just need to look back and see everything that we've done. Again, we've gotten moderate Democrats in support of getting rid of the filibuster. We really can't take that for granted. And we've still got some work left to do, but we've accomplished a ton. So we just need to keep going for this next little bit before we run out of time. So again, if you want to join an Indivisible group, you can go to indivisible.org and go to our map and find a group near you. And we hope that you join up. And it's just been a pleasure to chat with you all about filibuster. And speaking of filibustering, to borrow Ellie's joke, I'm going to stop talking. But thanks so much.
Nothing better than Senate process jokes. I've learned in my experience. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Adam, Trey. That was really helpful discussion. There were a whole bunch of questions that we didn't get to. We will grab them. We will try to respond over email if we can. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us. We'll find a way to get your email address in there or find us on Twitter. I'm sure you can find us all easily on Twitter. But with that, I will hand over to Jen Mandelblatt, who's my colleague She works with the Hub Project. She works on the Fix Our Senate campaign with me. She's long, a lot of experience helping to turn these complex issues and advocacy campaigns into successful campaigns, into ones that actually reach people where they are and help people activate and get to work on the issues they care about. Not just talk about it, not just complain about it, but take the kind of actions that Megan was talking about and that lots of folks are working on that actually make a difference. So I'll hand it to Jen for some final words and to give us some tools to take action.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ellie. And as we have discussed here tonight, people don't wake up in the morning and say, that pesky filibuster, but they think about the fact that they can't get a living wage, that they can't access the healthcare that they need, that they're afraid to go to school or walk down the street or go to the grocery store because gun violence is met with thoughts and prayers and not action. So we know that we are in a time where we need real action. So once you have done everything that Megan has said, you have signed up for an indivisible group. If you aren't already in one, you're bringing your indivisible group together. We want to make sure that we make those calls to the senators, to our lawmakers, and say, now is the time to act. So we have put together with Fix Our Senate a toolkit that I'm going to drop in the chat, and I will also make sure that Jamie and the Demcast team has it, that provides a shell of language that you can use so that you can plug in the issues that matter most. So we provided some language on how do you talk to your senators about the filibuster, and now you can include, I'm reaching out to you because I'm passionate about raising the minimum wage. So once you get their support for raising the minimum wage, you hit them with the 1-2 punch and you come back and you say, okay, in order to do that, we need to get rid of the filibuster. So encourage you to use that language, do with it what you will, put it in your own voice. We know it always is more powerful when you're reaching out to your senators, when you're speaking your truth and from the heart. They want to hear from you. They want to be moved by you. Their job is to pass legislation that impacts real people every single day. So let them know this isn't just DC insiders and wonks talking about the filibuster. It's people in every corner of this country saying now is the time for action. We are done waiting. We elected you to lead. We expect you to make good on your word. And we are just so grateful to work with Battleborn Collective, Indivisible, and Demcast with the Fix Our Senate Coalition. So please do plug in, follow along with us at fixoursenate.org, and at Fix Our Senate is our handle on Twitter and Facebook. And let us be a resource to you as you help lead this fight forward. So thank you so much for letting us join you tonight. And with that, I will pass it over to Jamie to close us out.
Thank you guys so much. I know there's still a lot of unanswered questions. We'll try to get to them if we can figure out how to save them. Jennifer, do you know how to save questions from?
We'll figure it out.
Okay, we'll figure it out. But thank you guys all so much. And then Lori, do you have the link? And we do have an email campaign that we've been emailing our senators. So we actually have different messaging for Democratic senators and then Manchin and then Republicans. So, and we will really continue to push out social media.
I do. I have dropped it a couple of times in the chat, but I'll go ahead and drop it
one more time.
Okay. You've missed
it. And then next week we're actually going to be joined by Jamie Harrison. So we're pretty excited about that. Jamie. It's nice to have an actual decent head of the DNC again. So who understands.
And I want to say too, I've seen a couple of comments and I appreciate what Megan said about not contacting, the senator if they're not your senator. And that's frustrating for those of us like me and Jamie that are in red states with senators who will absolutely shoot themselves before they would ever sign on to, S1 or to eliminate the filibuster. So, there's still plenty for you to do. You can educate everybody in your surroundings. You can reach out to people in other states that have senators who have not spoken. You can speak out on social media. And really put, we need to put the thumb screws to these senators and we need to hold them accountable. And every time they vote against something that helps Americans, we're going to bring that right back to them. And we're going to remember, we need to tell them, we're going to remember when you didn't vote for this. We're going to remember this. Don't take credit for this when we get checks so that we can sustain ourselves through the pandemic. Don't be taking credit for that because you didn't vote for it. So I think it's just really important that we all feel like there's plenty for us to do. And if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to me or Jamie. We will help you.
Yeah, and Common Cause is doing phone banks into West Virginia and Arizona. The local groups have asked that all texting stop. The people are getting overwhelmed with text and they're actually opting out now, which will prevent them from contacting them at a later date. And so they are really trying to use one phone bank list so that people are not getting bombarded from all these different groups. So if you want to phone bank into Arizona and West Virginia, please use the Common Cause. That has been reiterated a lot the last 2 days by the groups on the ground that are working on this. So, and you know, everyone knows, respect the locals. They know how to talk to the people in their state. So, but this has been so fabulous. Thank you guys so much.
Yes, thank you very much for joining. I think this has been very helpful. All right, and since we are 3 minutes over, we will sign off. And thank you all very much. And we will look forward to next week popping in to see what Jamie Harrison has to share with us.
All right, thanks guys.